Good evening, committee, council, and mayor. I'm Kathleen Mallory, Planning and Sustainability Manager, and I'm joined this evening with Ginny Gaston with PlaceWorks, who's our housing consultant. This evening, we'll be giving a presentation on the 2021 through 2029 draft housing element. The city's sixth housing element is a required element of the general plan. The housing numbers used in the housing element are referred to as the Regional Housing Needs Assessment, or RHNA, and they're set by the Southern California Association of Governments. The housing element is required to be reviewed and certified by the California Department of Housing and Community Development, or HCD. The housing element covers an 8-year state mandated schedule, which in this instance is for the years 2021 through 2029. The housing element is required to be adopted by the City Council no later than October 15th, 2021, or the city will be out of compliance with state housing element law and subject to consequences such as limited access to state funding and risk of lawsuit. In terms of the next 8 years in our RHNA cycle, which covers the years 2021 through 2029, in Ventura County, the RHNA allocation in total was 24,452 dwelling units. Oxnard's RHNA was 8,549 units. And while the city of Oxnard's population is approximately 25% of the overall county, we received a 35% RHNA allocation for the next 8-year cycle. The RHNA allocation for the next 8-year cycle is laid out as follows. The total, as mentioned, was 8,549. The RHNA allocation is divided into a variety of income categories, and the numbers that we're required to accommodate, the number of units, are identified on this table. So, for example, over the next 8-year time frame, the city's required to provide for housing of 920 units in the extremely low category. And the income limits that are laid out there are set in May of each year and are identified on the far right. In terms of our work on the housing element, we really began this back in January of last year when we had a meeting with the Housing and Economic Development Committee where we spoke about and received direction from that committee on local preference and inclusionary housing. The direction from that committee was that the city's inclusionary housing ordinance would be looked at over the next 8 years. Particularly, the direction was to continue with our 10% inclusionary ordinance for projects that are 10 or more units. And then for urban village areas, 15% of the units would be identified as affordable units, and that we would continue with the current language in our ordinance in terms of local preference for those affordable units where feasible. The Housing and Economic Development Committee asked staff to evaluate strategies within the housing element to update and encourage local preference in all new housing development. And again, that's where feasible. And you'll see program policy, H2.1 speaks to local preference for affordable housing, and it requires that we continue that program where legally possible. And examples where it's legally possible involve those projects with a development agreement or through the implementation of a condition of approval, implementing that development agreement, or when the city has funding that they can offer and provide for the project. Staff over the next 8 years with our housing element will evaluate the feasibility of local preference requirements, and also will continue to discuss the inclusionary housing requirements and ordinance with housing advocates. Currently, there is a regional housing study going forward for inclusionary housing, and the city will continue to be involved in that regional discussion in terms of the update to that regional inclusionary housing ordinance. Continuing on our background work that helped to provide direction on to the housing element that you have before you this evening. In October, the City Council provided direction to discontinue the All Affordable Housing Opportunity Program, or AHOP, and instead utilize the state's default density of 30 units per acre for lower income units. Additionally, the direction was to utilize up to 1,000 accessory dwelling units or junior ADUs to meet the lower income RHNA. And then, as we just covered a moment ago, to implement local preference strategies in the city's inclusionary housing ordinance where feasible, and then to continue setting the inclusionary housing percentage requirements. Finally, there was reference to looking at a study for the planning and study and planning and adoption of potential program looking at housing in the business and research park areas, as well as selected other commercial centers. And along with that, we'll be looking at the area known as our high quality transit corridor, which is from the 101 down Oxnard Boulevard. Items 5 and 6 on the slide speak to studying housing opportunities in that corridor, the HQTC corridor, as well as the specific BRP areas and selected commercial centers. On March 9th of this year, the Housing and Economic Development Committee provided direction on a new program that we identified as a result of our sites inventory work that will be covered later in the presentation. The direction during that meeting on October 9th was to develop an institutional housing program. What that means is that we would be looking at vacant or underutilized parcels, which are associated with institutional properties, which are typically known as schools or churches, hospitals, or lodges, and that we would look at the opportunity for housing on those types of parcels over the next 1 to 3 years. Ideas of housing opportunities that could occur in those areas include supportive housing, affordable housing, or shelters with existing assembly or institutional uses. So over the next 1 to 3 years, if we determine that that program makes sense for the community and that there's need for additional housing units in those areas, we will be creating development standards to encourage and facilitate that type of housing. On March 24th, just last month, we conducted a community workshop and received input on our draft housing element, the same element that is before you this evening. Many questions were raised, and those are summarized within the attachment before you this evening. Attachment D summarizes the input we received from the community along with our response to that. And generally, those the comments pertained to the continuation of the AHOP or what will happen when the AHOP program goes away. How does COVID impact the housing element? If we're facilitating permitting, what recommendations are there for streamlining? There were a number of questions pertaining to overall farm worker housing and the need for robust policies and programs to support that type of housing. There were also questions regarding accessory dwelling units and junior ADUs. Further, there was a question in terms of the sufficiency of the RHNA buffer, which is the identification of a certain number of units above the 8,529, or above the lower income buffer number. And additionally, there were questions about parking and how parking is impacted by affordable housing, or what options there were that we have to address parking within lower income housing units. As mentioned, the responses are summarized in attachment D. At this point, I'm going to turn the presentation over to PlaceWorks to go through more regarding the RHNA.
Thank you, Kathleen. So this slide follows the introduction that Kathleen provided to the RHNA numbers. This gives some more detail about what the city is proposing to meet the RHNA. So you see the RHNA in the different categories across the top of the slide. There are 4 categories in terms of the way that we're proposing to address the RHNA. That would be anticipated ADUs or accessory dwelling units over the course of the planning period. Vacant sites that are appropriate for housing, zoned for housing, or will be changed to be zoned for housing. Similarly, non-vacant sites that also will receive changes to zoning or land use if needed to address the income category that they have been assigned to in the housing element. And then finally, there are 2 sites that are pending annexation to the city, and they would provide about 1,100 units once annexed, mostly in the moderate and above moderate categories, with some in the lower income categories. You can see here that each of the income categories has sufficient units through this approach to meet the RHNA. Next slide, please. This slide shows a map that's also in supplement 1 of the housing element of all of the sites that are proposed to address the RHNA. So all of the vacant and non-vacant sites, as well as the annexation sites. They are spread throughout the city. We do have an inset showing the downtown area where there are quite a few sites identified. So we wanted to zoom in on that some. And you can also look at the supplement to take a look at details for the sites that are proposed to meet the lower income portion of the RHNA. Each of those has a page with a detailed graphic and other information. Next slide, please. So a little bit more information about the sites that are proposed in terms of the lower income category. So out of the 8,549 RHNA number, 2,911 of those units are in the lower income categories, extremely low, very low, and low. And what the state defines as suitable in terms of allowed density for those sites is 30 dwelling units to the acre. That's known as the default density for the city of Oxnard, and that's something that's defined for every jurisdiction across the state. There is a relatively new state law where certain sites in a city, either because they've been included more than once or twice in a previous housing element, or if they get rezoned at a certain time, need to provide by right review or ministerial review for projects that have at least 20% of the units affordable and deed restricted for affordable households. So that's defined on here. And the city does have some sites that are repeat sites that fall into that category. If the city does change their zoning on all of the sites that are needed to make up the approach to the RHNA that we discussed previously before the 15th of October of this year, then they have some more discretion. If not, then that by right would apply to more of the sites in the housing element land inventory. And so the city plans to change the zoning and the land use on some of the sites using an overlay zoning approach. And there will be more detail forthcoming on that. The city's working on the approach to that right now. And that, I think, is it for this slide. Next slide, please. We wanted to talk about some of the examples of the sites that are in the inventory. We're happy to discuss any of the sites further after the presentation, but wanted to focus on some of the larger sites. These two on this slide are vacant sites, and they're both in the Business Research Park zone. As Kathleen mentioned, that is an area that we're focusing on with a couple of the programs in the housing element, and there are multiple sites listed in this zone. One is on Outlet Center Drive, the other is on Ives Avenue, and they both have, interest in developing housing in terms of the property owner, and they are both pretty good size, so they would lend themselves to developing, significant housing projects, as well as some other things about them that are positive, like their proximity to amenities and transit. Next slide, please. This is an example of a non-vacant site. So as you can see, there are structures and parking lot on this site. This is the Ventura Pacific site, and it is a 6+ acre site that is does have an owner who is interested in developing multifamily housing, and it also is close to amenities and schools. So it is considered a good site to include in the housing element. Next slide, please. This is a site that's in the downtown and is a vacant site. It is a little bit smaller, but it has a project already proposed on it that would actually yield over 200 dwelling units per acre. That's called the Central Terrace Apartments Project, and it would be 100% affordable units with one manager unit. And you can see some of the renderings and design from that proposed project here. Excuse me. It is not approved at this point, but is moving forward in the process. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Thank you. Oh, thank you. So we wanted to talk a little bit about the new programs that are proposed in Chapter G of the housing element. Some of the programs that are in there are continued from the previous housing element, but there are quite a few new ones. Some of that is in response to new state laws since 2017 when the last housing element was adopted, and some of it is in response to other community-driven efforts. So we'll talk a little bit about these. Program 3 is relates to the rezoning that is needed to meet the RHNA. So we already talked about that on a previous slide. So this is the program that implements that work. Programs 30 and 31 are also related to zoning changes that are also needed on some of those sites. And this is in response to a recent state law that I mentioned where some sites that have been used multiple times in the city's housing element require changes to the zoning to allow by right review. Program 32 is a grant-funded program that the city is currently working on, a downtown infrastructure and financing study. Kathleen already spoke about Program 33 and actually Program 35 on the next slide. And these are also grant-funded programs. Next slide, please. Program 34 is in response to Senate Bill 35, which passed since the last housing element, and that requires the city to put in place a procedure or policy for what happens when a project comes forward that is subject to Senate Bill 35 streamlining an affordable housing project, or if there is a potential applicant who would like to know what they, if they are eligible for that streamlining. We talked about Program 35, the Business Research Park Zone Study Program. Programs 36, 37, and 38 all relate to accessory dwelling units. So these programs all include efforts that the city is already undertaking or will be undertaking to promote and facilitate accessory dwelling unit development. And that, that supports the number of 1,000 accessory dwelling units that is proposed in the housing element. Program 39 is in response to state law. If a site has residential units on it that are affordable and it is proposed for a redevelopment, then those units must be replaced in that new development. So the same number of units in addition to any new units that are proposed. And lastly is the Program 40, the institutional program, which Kathleen also touched on, taking a look at housing where there are institutional uses. Next slide, please. We did hold a meeting with the planning, we went to the Planning Commission last Thursday, April 1st, to bring this item to them. And there was a good amount of input received. There were a couple letters received ahead of the meeting, and then several people spoke during the meeting. This slide highlights the input. Barbara Macri-Ortiz wrote a letter and also spoke during the meeting. And the suggestions from that letter were to participate in the county's farm worker housing study and also to fund the Ventura County Trust Fund, Housing Trust Fund. Those were suggestions for programs to be added to the housing element. The letter also suggested that the section on farm worker housing in the background report of the draft element be expanded to include some additional data on farm worker housing numbers in the county in Oxnard. And then also the letter, letter noted some minor edits and typographical errors. So the city is looking into adding the 2 programs that were requested, and that is going to depend on decisions by the city council in terms of funding commitments. And then the data that is in the draft before you was the best available data at the time in terms of farm workers, but staff is happy to add the additional data that is in the draft Ventura County document to round out that section. There was also a letter from People Self-Help Housing, and a couple of people, including Veronica Garcia, commented during the Planning Commission meeting in support of that letter. It did include multiple recommendations for additional programs for the housing element, and some of the topics included the inclusionary housing ordinance, increased density, and by right development. And the city staff is taking a look at that letter and looking for more input on what is needed and to respond to that. During the Planning Commission, several representatives from CAUSE spoke, and they emphasized the need for rent stabilization and just cause ordinances. Next slide, please. At the end of the Planning Commission meeting, the commission voted to move the recommendation, which was to send the draft housing element to the city council for their review. They also added to that motion considering participation in the 2 County of Ventura farm worker housing programs that were discussed on the last slide, and also considering developing rent stabilization and just cause ordinances. Next slide, please. Here's the schedule that we're anticipating for the rest of the housing element update. We're here tonight to receive your input. Then the draft will go to the city council on April 29th. If they authorize, then it will be submitted to Housing and Community Development at the state for their official review starting in early May. That's a 60-day review. And in the meantime, the city's working on the CEQA review, as well as working with HCD during that time to address any comments they may have. We hope to have that process wrapped up in mid to late summer, and then take the adoption draft to the commission and council in August and September in order to be in good time to meet that October deadline. Next slide, please.
Thank you for that.
To Kathleen.
Perfect. Thank you for that. So thank you for the details on the draft housing element programs. So with that, our recommendation is that the Community Service, Public Safety and Housing and Economic Development Committee receive a presentation in the 2021 through 2029 draft housing element, known as the 6th cycle housing element. Also provide input on the new Planning Commission recommended draft housing element programs that were just summarized. And then finally, that the recommendation is to move forward from committee then to council ultimately, and then council's approval to submit the draft housing element to the state of California HCD for their review. This concludes our presentation, and we're happy to answer any questions that you may have.